Thank you very much, and good evening all. Apparently it's being streamed live on the web, so there's a possibility I might end up behind bars for the things I'm about to say. Right. I would like to start by doing a 0 to 600 in 10 seconds, starting with biplane airliners, 50 miles an hour, maybe 100 miles an hour, flying boats, 200 miles an hour, piston props, 300, turboprops, 400, first jets, 500, turbofans, 600. And it was during the Second World War they began to encounter the sound barrier, and something strange was happening. The aircraft was falling to bits and so on. And Miles Aircraft Company decided to embark on a program to try and break the sound barrier. And the aircraft looks something like this. And Eric Brown was the designated test pilot. Now, had they been allowed to proceed with the project, Eric Brown would have been the first man to have broken the sound barrier. But in the event, the project was cancelled in '44, and the data was handed over to the Americans. And to give Bell, the aircraft company, the credit, they took over the project effectively and eventually broke the sound barrier with the X-1 aircraft. What exactly is the problem? Now, here comes the science bit. I'm just going to try and explain the strange things that happen when you go supersonic. First of all, some basics that you probably would remember from your school days. Just 3 items I want to bring to your attention. That's all for the time being. If I have, I'm going to need a bit of help here. Can you just hold this? Let's say I got hold it so that people can see. Come on. Right, hold it like that. Let's say I got a pipe, and what I want to do is find out what actually is causing all these bits and pieces to break up. If I got a pipe whereby I have we've got air flowing through, and the area of cross-section is changing. So if I turn it around, for example, like that, as that air hits this particular pipe section, you find that it begins to speed up when it's subsonic. Right, 3 basic things. The first one is what it says over there. The total energy at any point must remain the same. There are 3 basic energy items. One is due to pressure, one due to motion, the kinetic energy, and one due to heat, the thermal energy. Total summation must remain constant. Just remember that at any station. Right, that's the first thing. Secondly, going back to your school days, you remember the Boyle's law, Charles' law, etc. There's a unique relationship between temperature, pressure, and density. Bear that in mind. And thirdly, you know that if there is no leakage, whatever air that goes in must come out the other side. Those are the only 3 things you have to remember. Juggle all the equations, and what you end up with is a strange result. What it tells you is that, first of all, when it's subsonic, you find that when you come across a restriction, the airspeed increases, it speeds up. It's very similar to, say, you got a garden hose which is not long enough, and in order to reach the furthest corner, what you do is you pinch the exit, and thereby you reduce the area cross-section, speed it up, and you can water the plants at the far corner. Fine, we understand all of that. But what then you get is something very strange. If that water was going supersonic, faster than the speed of sound, things go the other way. It actually slows down. Surely this can't be right. It's all counterintuitive. The only way to find out whether you're on the right track is to conduct experiments, and the tests did validate this particular point. Right, we are engineers. We need to understand why this is happening. We know it happens, but it's a good idea to try and understand why it happens. So basically, I'm very, very thankful to many, many numerical modelers. There are some in the audience here. If you go slower than the speed of sound, the sound waves hit the restriction up ahead and send back an echo, and they seem to inform the particles that there's a restriction coming up, get in lane, speed up, and to avoid congestion, maintain the streamline. That's fine. If you go faster than the speed of sound, you're overtaking your own wave, and the end result is that you never get this warning. That particle smashes into the wall. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 immediate consequences. The first one is obvious, which is that it is going to slow down, the speed decreases. The second one is that you get congestion. The pressure increases, which is a good thing. We are going to make use of that to aid the engine efficiency. Unfortunately, there's a third effect, which is that as it smashes into the wall, you find that part of the energy is dissipated as heat. The temperature increases, which is something we do not want. So now I know that there's a means by which I can slow things down, and it enables me to get an engine. To this day, we have not designed an engine that will accept supersonic air. The nearest we have come to is an engine with no moving parts. It's a ramjet engine, whereby you're trying to get a supersonic combustion in a stabilized form, but it's not been well demonstrated yet. Right, so those are the things. So with your permission, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow down the subsonic air. I had to match a supersonic aircraft with a subsonic airframe. So I'm going to slow it down using the restriction until it hits the speed of sound, but then to slow it down still further, I'm going to have a second funnel attached. Can you just hold it together? Attached to the first one. So I'm going to slow it down to the speed of sound, and then to slow it down even further, I'm going to diverge it. I'm going to diffuse it. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to converge the duct by restricting the passage, and then I'm going to diverge it. The reason I'm spending a lot of time on this is that it's absolutely crucial for you to understand that this particular match is very, very important in order to get a supersonic airframe to talk to a subsonic engine. So, and of course I have to do the same thing for the exhaust section as well. Sometimes in literature you'll refer to this as the Condi duct. It simply stands for convergent divergent duct. Okay, thanks very much. So, what next? Well, one of the things we need to try and find out is how to manage the flow. The simplest way is to have a center body here, which is going to restrict the passage there, and then up to the point where you have the sonic throat, and then it will gradually diverge it to slow it down further for before it hits the engine face. And one of the things you have to be careful about is this: the way it slows down is not very graceful. When things go supersonic, things happen over a definitive boundary, and that results in these shock waves here. So what you now need to do is manage these series of shock waves, and somehow at that point, that is your terminal shock, or we in the UK call it the normal shock, and we have to try and engineer the whole thing. So another strange thing that happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that because the pressure is increasing every time it slows down, you find that the pressure in there when you go supersonic is greater than the pressure outside. Force will always act from high pressure to low pressure. And the end result is that you start to generate thrust from the front end. In fact, what's strange is that at very low speeds, you find that the force from the front end is virtually nothing. But as you go faster and faster and go supersonic, that thrust contribution increases significantly. Ladies and gentlemen, at supersonic speeds, most aircraft, the 3/4 of the thrust actually comes from the front section of the engine, not the hot rear section. So that's a quick run through. What I'd like to now to do is have a look at how this was engineered into actual aircraft. This is the intake of a MiG-17. This was apparently it was the very first transonic fighter aircraft. As you can see, you got the restriction beginning to come in. And of course, the Russians are learning all the time. So for the next one, MiG-19, which was designed to go supersonic, they've got a center body there. And so we are beginning to manage the deceleration of supersonic air to subsonic air before it hits the engine face. And wouldn't it be nice if you could conduct the flight at different supersonic speeds? It would be nice if you can get that center, the bullet fairing, to move up and down, forward and backwards. So for the MiG-21, they had a movable cone, and this is that apex of the cone is very, very important because that determines the location of the mark cone. Extremely important. If you don't get that right, you end up upsetting the flow inside, and it can result in horrible engine surges and vibrations and so on. The Americans often refer to this as an unstart. Avro, when you go to a very large aircraft, of course, you can't have an intake at the nose section and exhaust all the way at the back. What you want is to try and put it somewhere else. Because the underside was needed for weapons carriage, they started off by putting the intake above the fuselage. It didn't work out very well, and they quickly changed it to intakes on the sides. Russians, on the other hand, decided to do the same thing, except they kept the engine and the intake. This was the very first effective supersonic bomber, apparently. And if you take a closer look, what you got is the shock cone over there, and this aircraft was, I understand, was the very first effective supersonic bomber. Also make a note of that. That is the undercarriage housing pod. We are going to find out that the Russians never managed to get the undercarriage packaging right. This is the French equivalent. Instead of a conic section, they got a semi-conical intake. This was their nuclear bomber, the Mirage 4. And now for something that some of you might recognize, the TSR-2. Now, I got into a lot of trouble with some people for saying that I never liked the intakes on the TSR-2. TSR-2 had a very high wing loading, about 7,000 newtons per square meter. And when you're approaching an airfield, you're forced to come in at a very high angle of attack. These intakes are not absolutely brilliant at accepting angles of airflow from different directions. What is surprising to me is that this was developed about the same time as Concorde. Concorde has two-dimensional intake, as you're about to see. Anyway, I was quite impressed with this aircraft, very innovative and so on, until I came across a North American proposal. Now, this looks like a TSR-2 head-on, but it has no tailplane. However, this was proposed several years before TSR-2 came on the scene. The alternative to having a central bullet fairing is to have these two gates, which basically do the same thing. They swing about this particular hinge points, and they restrict the passage, so you get a converging duct, then a diverging duct, and basically it does the same thing. Initially, it was decided to have the doors swing about a normal axis, a vertical axis, when the aircraft stands on the ground. And North American came up with this strange layout where they placed the intake just above or just behind the cockpit. And it was decided that it was not a very wise thing to do, because the pilots had to be very careful, the engines, to make sure that the engines were switched off when they got in and out of the cockpit. Anyway, that turned out to be not a brilliant idea, but what they then decided was to split the two-dimensional intake and put it on either side of the fuselage, and that is what the Russians did with the Tupolev 22 follow-on model. And if you look at the close-up, that is what it looks like. That splitter plate is basically there to make sure that you don't get the, excuse me, the dirty air from the boundary layer. And a slightly more advanced version was this one. And eventually they decided that although it's pretty good at handling crosswinds, they're not brilliant at handling air at high angles of attack. So instead of letting the door swing about a normal axis, why not let it swing about a lateral axis? And that was what was proposed. So what you now have is an intake that looks something like that. And this became the standard, and this is pretty standard to this day. However, by the way, that is just a comparison. That's the old intake, and this aircraft is still in service, I believe. North Americans went for the same thing with the A5 Vigilante. So everyone's beginning to sort of home in on this two-dimensional intake, which can handle high angles of attack, including, this is MiG-29. That's basically from that, you can work out the thickness of the boundary layer and so on. And carrying on to this one, the very latest from, or the most brutish model, I would say, from MiG, is this MiG-31. What surprised me is how heavy it is. It's as heavy as a 100-seat regional jet. It's heavier than that Avro RGX parked over there. Unbelievable what these things could do. Anyway, just to bring you up to date, somebody asked the question, do we really need to have all these moving parts inside? Wouldn't it be nice to have something solid state, no moving parts, which is better for stealth purposes? And so it was formulated in the 80s, tested in the 90s, in an F-16. That is the original intake. This is the current intake. And this is what it looks like from the front. What you have is this hump here. We now have mathematical methods whereby we can get into the boundary layer itself and understand what's going on. So you're making use of the shaping to divert the boundary layer away. So it's a diverterless supersonic intake. And to my surprise, the first group of people who actually made use of this were the Chinese. These are Chinese Pakistani aircraft, JF-17. And particularly thankful to many members of staff for giving me a chance to get a close-in look, especially at the Turkish air show. The first aircraft that we'll be getting with diverterless supersonic intake is this one, the JSF. And one of the other things is to note is that it's got inwardly canted intakes. Now, isn't that brand new? Not quite. Americans did this in the 1950s. The F-105 Thunder Chief has got inwardly canted intakes. Right. Let's have a look at a passenger variant of supersonic transport. This was Royal Aircraft Establishment's proposal in 1954, seats facing backward, and it looks like an inflated starfighter, an F-104. Straight thin wings, and the problem here was that despite putting fuel all over the place, it still did not have adequate capacity to transport passengers long distance. So what happened next? Well, this is Handley Page's proposal. What they've got is a flying wing, which is going to house the passengers as well as the fuel, the cockpit module on one end, and a fin at the other end. And the whole thing was going to rotate. I'm going to need help here. Can you just... hold on. Hold on. So basically it flew in that direction with the cockpit here and a fin, say, along here. And you changed the sweep angle so that as you go faster and faster, you kept the cockpit module lined up with the airflow, but as you slowed down and had to come in for landing, you would keep on, hold it like that, okay. Keep the fin aligned with the airflow, you basically reduce the sweep angle and so on. Anyway, eventually people decided it was a bit of a daft idea, so that particular slew wing model was dropped. But there were some good things about it. Those who are into stress analysis will appreciate that this sort of thing is fairly easy to sort out stress-wise. Armstrong-Whitworth, on the other hand, went to the other extreme. They decided that the aerodynamics is horrible here because as the air flows, the boundary layer keeps on growing. The thickness of the boundary layer is proportional to the drag force, basically. And is it possible to somehow, using a bit of geometric trickery, get rid of excessive span-wise flow? And they came up with this one, the M-wing. The idea here is that as the flow starts, you find that there's less distance to travel and therefore the boundary layer thickness is small and so on. But it became a bit of a nightmare to analyze in terms of stress analysis and so on, so that was dropped as well. English Electric came up with this proposal. Now for the first time they're learning about Mach cones and they're following the cone lines and came up with the slender delta proposal. And one of the problems is that the aerodynamics plays havoc as you go through the sound barrier. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate this with this little model. Can you just hold it again, please? I'm sorry. Right. First of all, the center of gravity, we all understand what it is. So hold it like that. Right. Can you just hold it at the nose section? Yeah, hold it like that. Yeah, okay. Right. Now, you have a center of gravity that is acting vertically downwards, but you also have, in addition to that, an aerodynamic version of it known as the aerodynamic center. Unfortunately, the center of gravity stays put as long as the weights remain where they are, as long as people don't walk about. But the aerodynamic center starts migrating depending on whether you're flying subsonic or supersonic. Now, one of the key things is you must keep that center of gravity in front of, so I'll hold this here. If this is your center of gravity point, you must hold that in front of the aerodynamic center, and that distance must remain constant. Now, when you go faster than the speed of sound, that aerodynamic center shifts rearwards. So you have to shift somehow the center of gravity back with it. Wouldn't it be nice if you can somehow come up with a shape whereby you can reduce the amount of shift so that the amount of fuel that needs to be pumped up and down to shift the center of gravity can be minimized? So what they did was, thanks very much. So what they did was have a look at the straight line leading edge and then try and bias the wing so that majority of the area was in the middle section where you wanted the aerodynamic center to stay. So you are minimizing the center of pressure shift. Center of pressure is very different to center of center of pressure. Center of pressure and aerodynamic center are two different things. For those who are technically minded, center of pressure is the point about which the pitching moment is zero, whereas center of aerodynamics is the point about which the pitching moment is constant if the angle of attack changes. Anyway, the end result is that what you want is to try and narrow the wing down there, broaden it at the midsection, and then narrow it down again because you want to stay within this mark cone. And the end result is that they tested two wings. This was the original wing, straight leading edge, and that was then modified, same fuselage. And what you now have is a very shallow S shape, the ogive planform. So just to recap, you have the straight delta, and then you have the OG or ogive planform. But on top of that, you can have an alternative, which is this Gothic. Now, Americans, God bless them, Lockheed at Skunk Works decided that they wanted, for whatever reason, the straight delta, but to cure the problem of shifting of the center of aerodynamics, they decided to put a Gothic structure at the front end, and out popped the Blackbird. What you have is a straight delta, and then they refer to this as the chines. That's what it looks like, this additional projection. Originally, for the YF-12A, they had it only up to the cockpit, but later versions, they took it all the way to the apex of the nose cone. So basically, what you have is that section there, which is trying to bring back the, or minimize the shifting of the center of aerodynamics. And I'd love to set these things as exam questions for my students. The other thing is, of course, in the case of SR-71, you have the chines or the Gothic section blended in with the fuselage. You can really do that in Concorde. You run into problems with providing windows for the passengers and so on. And the other thing is there are other issues. Because that area is larger, you can also get a larger pressure drag. And you have to be careful about the exposure of the skin area as well. Anyway, this was the particular the configuration that was chosen for Concorde. Now, one or two other proposals. This was from Hanley Page. Again, it's an ogive platform. I don't know what went wrong, but somebody decided the greater the number of engines, the better it is. This particular one had a dozen engines on each side. 24 engines in total. Anyway, somebody decided at Hanley Page decided this was a bit silly, and they redesigned it, and this one had only 4 engines on each side, 8 engines in total. And going on to the Bristol proposal, you can still see the ogive planform, but you now got, they seem to run into some sort of low-speed handling problems, and the end result was that they decided to insert a canard low down, and so that was Bristol's proposal. And French, on the other hand, came up with this idea, canard and twin-finned configuration, but eventually everyone homed in on the fact that they really did not need a canard. You do have some aerodynamic strikes to the front on Concorde, but the final configuration was that you are just going to have an ogive planform, single fin, no canard, no tailplane. So that was the final configuration that was decided upon. And how do you know that it's going to fly well? Well, there's only one way to find out whether slender delta wings will perform adequately at low speeds for landing and takeoff purposes. I'm sorry, the quality of the slide is not brilliant, but this is the Handley page 115, and it proved to be okay. It did have its quirks, but it was demonstrated that the slender delta will handle low speed flights as well. It won't be very efficient. The lift to drag ratio is very low, but on the other hand, it did prove that it could be landed safely. So, homing in on the final set of the road to Concorde, if you like, is we have experience with the Lightning, the Vulcan, the BAC 221, the H115, and so on. And the French ended up with the same solution based on their findings of the Mirage and other models. So, everyone was happy. So we now know what the aircraft is going to look like. So let's look at what the others were doing. Apparently, this was the very first Russian supersonic bomber, rather crude. Remember, look at the undercarriage. They never seemed to figure out how to configure them for minimum weight and elegant design. This is the B-58 Hustler. It was supposed to replace the B-52 bomber. It did not. In fact, it was quite a difficult aircraft to fly, and apparently it claimed quite a few lives as well. Although it had 4 engines, even if you lost one engine, I understand it effectively meant the loss of the flight. So they lost a hell of a lot of these aircraft. I was stunned when I went to Moscow and saw this aircraft. I couldn't believe what I saw. I didn't even know about this the company, Myassechev. This is an M50, and again, a sort of a brute force technology. Look at the undercarriage there. It's got engines at the wingtips as well. I can't understand why you would want to put engines at the wingtips, but anyway, that aircraft I don't think went beyond the prototype stage. Americans wanted a replacement for the B-58 and the B-52, and they came up with the swing wing B-1A aircraft, which was going to be supersonic. Now, apparently, they got so frustrated at not being able to make much progress, they invited some Concorde engineers to come over. And Concorde engineers, led by Ted Talbot, I think, at that time, looked at the intakes and said straight away it didn't stand a chance. And anyway, the end result was that the B-1A supersonic bomber was effectively cancelled and turned into this subsonic B-1B aircraft with fixed engine intakes. It has got supposedly supersonic capability, but it's only for short-term dash purposes. And this was Russians' answer to the B-1 aircraft. You see Tupolev 160, and what you have is very, very similar: swing wing, cruciform tail, 4 engines, and so on. Now, Tupolev have generated a lot of data, or gathered a lot of knowledge on supersonic flights. So they were chosen, I guess, to produce Russia's first passenger aircraft. And their first proposal was this one, the Tupolev 144 prototype. What amazed me is the undercarriage again. Each leg has, on each axle, there are 4 tires, and each leg has got 3 axles, a dozen tires on each leg. And the question is, can you find accommodation to retract the whole lot into the airframe? I'm not sure what happened next. It looks like they wanted rough field capability as well, to be able to land on Siberian wastes and so on. Anyway, it then quickly transformed into the next model, which is this one. Now, the other thing I'd like you to note is that, a very important lesson they learned is drag reduction. If you look at the wings there, that wing is straight. There is no droop. There is no anhedral. And they quickly realized that this transverse camber is extremely important, and this one sports that particular camber. But look at the undercarriage again. It's got these engine intakes, and the undercarriage is somewhere buried in the engine. So I was quite puzzled about this. So again, when I got the chance, I took a photograph. That's your leg. It retracts forwards, but the intakes are together. How was restriction carried out? Well, amazingly, what actually happened was it underwent rotation about the excuse me, about the bogie beam. So if I'm the Tupelo 144 and the wheels are like this, the first thing that happened was that the whole undercarriage was rotated about the bogie beam, and then it got retracted upwards into a bay in between the engine. So they must have bifurcated the engine airflow somewhere along the line and then rejoined it at the back. What a horribly complicated way of doing things, but anyway, it did work. The other thing is the canards. I was quite impressed with the way they dealt with the canards. Gentlemen, you can't get more complicated than this. This canard, as it's retractable, but as it came out, it deployed a double slotted flap and a slat. I don't know of any aircraft where a canard has a slat. And my God, this is sort of mechanisms gone mad. This in addition to the tilting nose. Anyway, the one thing I was assured of, those who have seen this thing fly, is that it did have exceptionally good takeoff and landing performance. Apparently at one of the, I think it was in 1973 Paris Air Show, 71 maybe, once Concorde needed the longest runway at Le Bourget and had to deploy the parachute, this thing landed on the shorter runway and turned off the runway before it reached the last taxiway. It had exceptionally good short takeoff and landing performance. Anyway, again I took a photograph of the housing, and that's what this is the front end, that's the main entrance door, and that's the housing. But that's a sort of packaging, or the smoothing finish was not there to reduce drag. I'm terrified of every bit sticking out in the airflow, which adds to the drag. In flight, she looked quite nice and smooth, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, they could not sustain supersonic cruise without the use of reheat, the afterburners. Just to give you an idea how expensive it is, in that Concorde over there, the Olympus engines, when you switch on reheat, the thrust goes up by 20%. The fuel flow rate doubles. So you have to, in this particular aircraft, they just needed one notch reheat to stay supersonic, but that killed the project. It became a gas guzzler and never had the range to cross the Atlantic. Another photograph of the Tupelo 144. Engines nicely grouped near the center line, and if one of the engines fails, you're not going to get an awful lot of imbalance moment directionally. 4 control surfaces, Concorde has only 3, and 2 rudders. Each rudder has got 2 actuators. These surfaces are so thin that those days you did not have the technology to package them inside the airframe, and everything adds to drag. In Concorde as well, all these actuators were housed outside the airframe for this reason. Anyway, I was quite impressed with the grouping of the engines. But then, for the follow-on project, I came across this. Clearly, they seem to have been very, very unhappy about the undercarriage location and the engines, and eventually they decided to place the undercarriage inboard with the engines outboard. Now, having engines coupled closely to each other quite often results in, if one engine fails, for whatever reason, it will take its neighbor with it. It's built like a semi-detached house with a common wall. So in this particular case, if you lose one of these engines, and this happened to Concorde as well, basically you're going to end up with an awful lot of yawing moment, which is going to try and destabilize the aircraft. You've got to have I don't know, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Anyway, if you think the Russians are sort of not brilliant at linkage mechanisms, the Americans, to some extent, are even worse. This was Boeing's proposal, believe it or not. This was the one that was originally chosen. This aircraft has got everything. First of all, it's got the tilting nose, but they probably found that the tilting nose resulted in the apex of the nose cone getting dangerously close to the ground, so they had to have a second tilting mechanism. It's a double hinged nose. It has got swing wing. It has got double slotted flaps, leading edge slats, and of course, where you put the engines, if you hang the engines under this wing, you've got to then have additional mechanisms to align the engine as the wing swept forwards and backwards. So the engines were hung under the tailplane. And of course, it's got 4 legs as well, 747 style. And I just thought, I don't know who the chief designer was, but this morphing mechanism's gone mad. So anyway, what they then did was, a couple of years later, came up with a much better proposal. So that's the one that we've been talking about, the Dash 200 series, 1966. What they proposed in the Dash 300 was much, much better. And you also still have the tailplane. Anyway, just for comparison of size, that's Concorde over there. And in the 70s, McDonnell Douglas came up with this proposal again with the tailplane. And the Americans seem to love either foreplanes or tailplanes. But anyway, there's one manufacturer, which we shall discuss later, who seemed to know what she or he was doing. Let's look at North American, the XB-70. This was going to replace the B-1B, the B-58 Hustler, the B-52, and so on. And the idea here was that this was going to be a Mark III, 3 times the speed of sound aircraft. And you obviously had the major shock cone over there, but they also had this additional pod which created a secondary shock cone, which then generated additional pressure increase on the underside, and that helped with the lift generation. Now, if you read the books, it will tell you that this lift was free. It was not, because that shock is being generated thanks to the thrust of these engines, which are consuming fuel. Anyway, one of the most innovative parts is that, remember I told you this aerodynamic center moves backwards as you start accelerating towards supersonic speeds. What North American did was to set up this hinge lines here, so the whole wing, the large parts of the wingtips folded downwards, and thereby you effectively reduced the area of the wing at high speeds at the back end, and thereby arrested the migration of the aerodynamic center. The other thing is, quite a few aircraft, when they're stable directionally at subsonic speeds, but they tend to go unstable at supersonic speeds due to 2 reasons. One of them is loss of fin effectiveness, and secondly, the air intakes can also sort of tend to destabilize depending on where they're located. By folding these wingtips downwards, they effectively double the number of fins and maintain directional stability. So anyway, this was one of the 2 prototypes in flight, and sadly, one of those was involved in a mid-air collision with a starfighter, and the entire program was cancelled. The remaining survivor, I believe, is at the museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. The other thing about going fast is heat. Now, the faster you go, it's not just a matter of the heat, the temperature increasing. It does not increase linearly. It increases by greater margins. Just to give you an idea, this is all in Fahrenheit. That's your Concorde temperature. Those are the temperatures that you will encounter if you want to go at 3 times the speed of sound. Now, the biggest problem with heat is not just the airframe, but everything else that goes with it. The glass that goes with it, the sealant for the windows, the liquids that go inside, the fuel has a habit of kicking out all the waxes and the additives at the temperature of about 120 Celsius. The engine oil, the lubricants, tend to become acidic at about 300 Celsius. Now remember, these aircraft they're designed for sustained high Mach number cruise, Mach 2 cruise. They're getting baked for hours on end. Have you got adequate thermal capacity within the airframe to sustain that kind of baking? That's one of the considerations you have to look at. The last thing you want is to start roasting the passengers inside. So this was Russia's answer to the XB-70. Again, I was pretty shocked when I saw this, how crude the whole thing is. But to give them credit, with very little resources, they were responding to some absolutely exotic products from the West. But I couldn't help wondering about this flight deck. If you take a closer look, it looked more like the cab of a diesel locomotive rather than the cockpit of a supersonic bomber. Anyway, that aircraft, I think, was only reached the prototype stage and did not get beyond that. Americans did not give up. They then wanted to go for a lifting body. This was going to be a hypersonic vehicle, 5 times the speed of sound. And I think President Ronald Reagan, on one of his speeches, referred to this as the Orient Express. And this was a wind tunnel model that was tested at Mississippi State University. And it was going to have not only go very, very fast, but also it was going to have supersonic combustion ramjets and so on. Anyway, that project too got cancelled. However, I'm glad to say that the supersonic combustion ramjet technology, the research is still going on, except that they're doing it with remotely piloted vehicles, uninhabited air vehicles. And the current vehicles, X-43 and X-51, they have reached about 6 times the speed of sound, but have so far demonstrated only about 2 minutes of sustained, stabilized fuel burn at supersonic speeds inside the combustion chamber. At the moment, it's got to be air-launched and boosted by a rocket motor to about 4 times the speed of sound before they can switch on the scramjet. Right, I think the time has come to look back at Concorde. What about Concorde's temperature? The maximum temperature allowed is at the tip of the needle, which is about plus 127 Celsius. This is clearly marked in the flight deck. So it displays the temperature, and the rule is simple. If you are beginning to approach that temperature, keep an eye on it, and if there's danger of it exceeding, pull back on the throttle, slow down. The maximum speed of Concorde is determined by the total air temperature. And just to give you a rough idea of the temperature distribution, it cools down quite rapidly up to about 85, maybe 89 Celsius at the tail cone. But today, we have better lubrication oil and better material to cope with slightly higher temperature. We can take it up to about 150 Celsius. At this point, I would like to give you a rough idea as to what the second part of the talk is going to be about. It's the refinements that were conducted to make Concorde a suitable vehicle for transatlantic travel. So I think we'll take a break there. Thank you very much.